The passing of former Premier Zhu Rongji is not only an enormous loss to the people of China, but to the people of the world. I'm Laurence Brahm, and I had the pleasure and honor of knowing Premier Zhu. First as a lawyer advising foreign investment, which he did so much to bring in foreign investment into China and transform the Chinese economy. Later as an advisor to the Chinese leadership, to the government, on a range of issues, from the globalization of the renminbi to the reform of the state-owned enterprises. And later on, working with him on the book China's Century, which he wrote the preface to, and working independently on a book about him, Zhu Rongji, The Transformation of Modern China, which was first published by John Wiley in English, and later by Open Page Publishing in Hong Kong in Chinese. I first met Zhu Rongji. It was around 1987 or 88, I think. He was then mayor of Shanghai. I was part of the Hong Kong American Chamber of Commerce delegation that was invited to Shanghai by then Mayor Zhu Rongji to see his own efforts at cleaning up a labyrinthine bureaucracy and making Shanghai open and transparent for quick approval of foreign investment. Before, the bureaucracy was so difficult, foreign investors couldn't, invest in Shanghai because there were so many different departments and they weren't collaborating with each other. And of course, Shanghai was once the Paris of the East, they said, the Wall Street of the East. It was one of the major world financial centers. And Zhu Rongji, as mayor, was determined to bring that back. So what he did was he brought all the different departments for approving foreign investment to one room. So he had what they called Yi Tiao Long Fu, the one dragon tail service. It's like a dragon. Everything is done there. It's one department after another. It's transparent, open, and verifiable. And it opened up the doors for investment to later pour into Shanghai. And we were in that delegation, and he was introducing his program. But before doing that, he came in the room late that day, and I'll never forget, he was wearing hiking boots, and they were covered in mud. And some of the businessmen in Hong Kong were very arrogant. They looked at him and they said, "Oh, the mayor of Shanghai doesn't know how to dress. He's wearing hiking boots and he didn't even clean them." And then Mayor Zhu Rongji was very humble, and he said to everyone, "My apologies for being late, but I was personally on construction site inspecting the construction of one of the major projects to make sure that that project is done on time." That's leadership. It's taking his hands and putting them on the project, going to the front line and making sure that everything's done the way it's supposed to be done. That's his character. And throughout his term as vice premier and later as premier, we saw again and again, Zhu Rongji would go to the front line, solve the problem firsthand. And I'll tell you a few stories about that. Of course, there was Deng Xiaoping would often come to Shanghai. He'd spend his Chinese New Year there. And certainly around 92, after his southern inspection, Deng Xiaoping talked a lot with Zhu Rongji about his ideas that really planning and market are nothing to do with theory or ideology. These are pragmatic tools, and they can be used one or the other or both simultaneously to be able to get better results for the economy. Economics is not about ideology. It is not about theory. Economics is about the most efficient use of resources to get the best benefit to the most people. And that's exactly what Zhu Rongji would do throughout his term as vice premier and premier. Coming to Beijing during the financial crisis, inflation crisis of the early 90s, very quickly he was in charge of the economy. And it's amazing, he actually himself took over as central bank governor to be able to manage the economy, to look at the numbers every day, and to be able to control inflation, bring it down, while at the same time clearing up a triangle debt situation which was threatening the whole financial system of the country. Fast forwarding on to 1997, and you had the Asian financial crisis. And he stood up against the advice of the IMF and World Bank that were encouraging the immediate opening of the economy, the shock therapist model that destroyed Indonesia's economy and Thailand during the Asian financial crisis. And he stood up and he said, no, I'm not following your policies. We are going to reform and open at our speed on our terms. And moreover, he told the hedge fund traders, you want to come to Hong Kong? I'll fight you because we will use China's foreign exchange reserves to back the Hong Kong dollar. Come, we're going to fight you. And all the hedge fund traders backed down. They all left the Hong Kong dollar alone. That's the fortitude and determination of this man who was able to transform China. And of course, the major transformation occurred when he was premier. I had the pleasure of being able to work with the State Council Office of Economic Reform, then led by Rongji, on many of the state-owned enterprise blueprints that were being looked at. And of course, the key thing here was he wanted to turn China's state-owned enterprises that were burdened with debt, burdened with burdens. I mean, they had to take care of housing, pension, healthcare, education. Everything was in the enterprise. People could be born, live their whole life, marry, have kids, and die in a state-owned enterprise, because these were societies or even small cities unto themselves. So if you're going to turn that social network into an efficient corporation with teeth that's going to go out there and compete on the international stage, he had to take the social burdens and shift them out of the enterprise. And to achieve that, it required a complete reform of the financial sector. So imagine, housing was once provided by the enterprise. Now housing has to go out. People have to buy their own property, but that means they need to be able to take a loan from the bank. The bank has to be able to have a mortgage. You have to have law for land use rights, for housing. All of that has to be kicked in. Just that one topic is a major reform. Now move it on to healthcare, pension funds, the creation of insurance companies, the insurance industry. All of this was happening in parallel. There is no question that Rongji's reforms of 1998, the state-owned enterprise reforms, were the largest major restructuring of any economy probably in the history of the world. And it was done successfully, almost seamlessly. And with this complete restructuring, we saw him moving on to the next stage, which was to get China into WTO, something that was constantly being blocked by the American negotiating team. Recalling the final negotiation for China's entry into WTO, Barchevsky and the U.S. trade team was in Beijing. Shi Guangsheng was Minister then of the Ministry of Commerce, then it was called MOFCOM, and the negotiations broke down again. And the delegation, the American delegation, was preparing to go back, when at the last moment at night, very late, they got a call and said, be at Shi Guangsheng's office tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. And they showed up like, what's new? And Shi Guangsheng talked and it kind of was stalling, and suddenly Rongji walked into the room. And he sat down and he personally negotiated the closing of the WTO deal. And of course, anything that couldn't be agreed at that moment, he put it into a memorandum to be subject to future discussions. Basically, he took anything that could not be negotiated at that time, put it into a protocol list to be dealt with later. And he grabbed those things that could be agreed with, and that was the framework. An amazing work of negotiation he personally did. And of course, Shi Guangsheng and Barchevsky signed that afternoon, and China entered WTO. Why was WTO so important? I say it's because Rongji was planning for China after Rongji. He wanted to have systems that would continue China's own process of economic reform and opening, the marketization of the Chinese economy, while he's still adopting the policies of planning and market together in a very yin-yang way, creating ever-present balance by combining the use of market and planning not as ideology, but as pragmatic tools for the betterment of the Chinese people through making the economy more efficient and balancing it whenever it needed to be. Those are the policies of Premier Rongji. And I was very happy much later to write a book called China's Century, the theme of which was the 19th century belonged to UK, the United Kingdom, the 20th century belonged to the United States of America, but the 21st century would be China's century. And Premier Zhu wrote the preface to that book. And I'll tell you a very funny story, because he received me at the Great Hall of the People, and I presented him with the American published book, which had a very exciting cover with a kind of electro dragon, you know, very kind of high-tech dragon on the front, and the version published in China that was more conservative. And he looked at both versions, and he turned to his Chinese team and he goes, "Hey, how come the American version, the design is better than our design?" And very quickly I said, "Premier Zhu, it's not which is better, it's different markets." And he broke out laughing. At that moment, many people said it's the only time they saw him just laugh. And I think, you know, he understood that these are two different markets, two different psychologies. And of course, he appreciated the approach of recognizing that both are good and both can be competitive in their own way, but different. And then I remember once asking him, because I was always fascinated with his own internal decision-making process. And I said to him, "Premier Zhu, at midnight, you're about to sign off on an economic policy. That policy could have an enormous effect on everyone. What is it that's going through your mind? What is it, your thought process in making that final decision?" And he said, very simply, the social psychology effect on a herd of sheep. And he said to me, "It doesn't matter how good your economic theory is. If you can't motivate people to follow your policy and to get the result that you want, then that theory's totally useless." And I think that really summarizes very much his approach to economics. Again, using market and planning together in parallel, without ideology, without theory, in a pragmatic way, almost like managing the yin and yang like a Tai Chi master would do to get a syncretic energy and to get the most chi possible for that economy, to benefit the most people with the most efficient use of resources. And so, with that, I'll say one thing. We're all going to miss you, Premier Zhu.